Well, good morning. It's nice to see some of you are not on holiday and away. And I'm just going to remove these enormously tempting Easter biscuits for fear that I munch them when I'm speaking. I'm going to speak this morning from a passage which is very familiar to all of us, the feeding of the 5,000. But I want to tell you why it's very personal to me. And that's because before Bev and I came to this church, we led a thriving youth group in Haywards Heath. And one evening, because we used to meet on a Sunday evening, we watched a film called Viva Cristo Rey, Long Live Christ the King. It was about a group of American Christians who lived close to the Mexican border and had been very challenged in their Bible study by this passage. It's the passage that says, when you have a meal, don't just invite your friends who can invite you back, but invite people who could never invite you back. And because they lived close to the border, and especially close to an enormous rubbish tip, where poor people picked things from this rubbish tip day after day, they decided they would take them a Christmas lunch. I'm going to slide on here, too many. Okay. A Christmas lunch. And they knew that, from a bit of research, there were about 125 people who picked things off this rubbish tip. They were desperately poor. And so they got 125 burritos and a few sides of ham, and they took them in pickup trucks, and they arrived on Christmas Day to feed people, only to discover that, in fact, there were 400 people there, and they didn't have enough food. But they decided to go ahead nevertheless. And as they gave out the burritos, there just seemed to be more. And as the guy who's carving the ham said, I carved the ham and I carved big thick slices, and I kept carving and it kept coming, and I kept carving and it kept coming. And at the end, not only had they fed 400 people, but they had so much food left over that they went home to some orphanages, 3 orphanages, to distribute the rest of the food. But that's not the point of my story, incredible though it was. Because the youth group, as they listened to this, were totally stunned. They were in silence, which was unusual for our youth group. And they started to pray afterwards, and they said, Lord, we are very touched by this video we've seen, and it's made us think, what do we do for the poor? How can we serve you? What would you have us do? I felt so proud of them. And then one of the group stood up and gave a message in tongues. And I thought, well, that'll put the cat among the pigeons, because I happen to know that nobody in the group speaks in tongues. Then somebody gave an interpretation. And I can remember it like it was yesterday, because this is what God said. He said, I am pleased with you this evening. I'm pleased at your humility and your willingness to serve. And I tell you this, I will bless each of you richly in your lives and in your Christian service. I confess with humility that there are very few times when I've heard God speaking directly. This was one of them. Sad there haven't been more. And it's a prophetic word that he has kept, actually, because if I think many years on, so many of those young people have moved into active ministry or are actually church ministers, and most of them, as far as I know, have stayed with their faith. An incredible story about a very important miracle, because this miracle uniquely is in all 4 Gospels. It's the only one that is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in 1936, in a place called Tabgha in Israel, this amazing mosaic was discovered. It's from a 4th century church, supposedly built on the site of where this miracle took place. 5 loaves and 2 fish. And it reminds us that this miracle was of immense importance to the early church. They revered this miracle and built this church to commemorate it. And if you look at the text, which Jane read so clearly, it starts with Jesus being upset and tired. He's upset because he's just learned of the death of John the Baptist. And he knows this is the first piece of the jigsaw that's fitting into place that will spell his own death. And he just wants to get away. As you'll know, when you feel sad, sometimes you just want to be by yourself, and so did Jesus. But it wasn't possible, because although he took a boat out onto the Sea of Galilee, the crowds walked around, because you can often walk faster than you can sail, and they walked around, and he saw them and had compassion on them, and came to the shore to a remote area to heal and to speak to them. Just worth remembering that Jesus is never too tired, never too exhausted, never doesn't have the time to hear our calls of prayer when we're desperate. And of course, the people are getting hungry, and there's nowhere to buy any food. It's a long time since I've walked around the shores of Galilee, but I can certainly tell you that when I did it many years ago, there was nothing. Even now, there aren't any villages. There's only Tiberias, and after that, frankly, nothing. And it was the same in Jesus' time. There were no supermarkets, there were no villages, there was nowhere to get food, and anyway, they didn't have enough money. Philip says in one of the other gospel accounts, it would take half a year's wages to feed these people. So they're a bit desperate. But Andrew comes up with an answer. The problem is it's not a very good one. I've got 5 loaves and 2 fish, he says. Don't get excited about this, people. These were very small barley loaves, the kind that a poor person would have. And as for the fish, they were probably the size of sardines. I don't know what they did in ancient times, whether they squashed them as we would do and made a sardine sandwich. But it wasn't going to feed many people, and it absolutely wasn't going to feed 5,000. They were in despair. And I think I know that feeling, because it takes me back to a time when I was in despair with a group of trustees for the Eleanor Foundation, which provides hospice care for people in Dartford and Gravesend. And as a trustee, we face a really difficult situation. We didn't have enough money. And, as trustees, you have to take these tough decisions sometimes. Our outgoings were simply more than the donations that we were receiving. And the only solution seemed to be to stop our children's hospice work. This meant the 2 nurses that we had who were caring specifically for children with life-limiting conditions would have to go. And it meant that a service that we provided would just cease. And I remember being with that team, and we said, okay, let's just spend a month praying about this and seeing if anything happens before we take this difficult decision. Well, something did happen, and it was quite remarkable. About 2 weeks later, a man in a gabardine coat came in and asked to see the founder, Graham Paroles. And the secretary, thinking this was a rather scruffy man, said, well, he was rather busy, actually. Oh, he said, well, I've just got this envelope to give him. She said, well, if you leave it here, I'll give it to him. And he walked out. When Graham opened the envelope, there was a cheque inside for £250,000. And we didn't even know who the guy was, which was deeply embarrassing. And it took quite a time to discover what his story was and why he'd made the donation. He was unknown to the charity, but I remember writing to him afterwards, and I said, your gift has changed so much and will enable us to retain our children's service. It's a lesson, isn't it? When you're desperate, don't forget to pray. We have to ask the question about the feeding of the 5,000. Was it a real miracle or not? Because liberal theologians have tried to explain it in 2 ways that would say it was much less than miraculous. Some say, if you can believe this, and it certainly doesn't respect the text, that actually the disciples and Jesus had stashed an enormous amount of food in the wilderness, and strategically revealed it at the point at which people were getting hungry. I know it's ridiculous, isn't it? Much more palpable is the theory that you will certainly have heard, that liberals say, which is that actually this was not a miracle of multiplication. It was just an outpouring of sharing. And that when the boy gave his picnic of 5 loaves and 2 fish, what happened was other people thought, well, we have brought a bit of food, and maybe we could share it with others. It doesn't respect the text, which of course says they had no idea where they were going to be, and that that's not what happened, and that the early church gave it such reverence. So I reject both of these explanations. And it's easy for us to be casual. This was an amazing miracle of multiplication, just as it was for those very poor people in Mexico. And there's a deeper meaning too. The Jewish perspective on this amazing miracle is this. Here's Jesus feeding people with bread in the wilderness. Now, to a Jew, that would immediately make you think of Moses asking God for bread to feed the people as they wandered in the desert for 40 years, and he fed them with manna from heaven. They would also think of the story of Elijah, who was fed by bread in the wilderness in a cave by the ravens. And later on, when he came to the widow and she said, I have only enough flour and oil to make 1 piece of bread. And he said, well, you do that then. And the next day she said, well, I've only got enough now for a piece of bread. And he said, do it. And it continued and continued. Or Elisha, who fed 100 people with just 20 loaves and 12 baskets of leftovers. Jewish people would say, surely this is Jesus saying, I will reestablish the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's why in John's account of this story, they say, this is the Messiah. This is the prophet who's come. We must respect him. We must hail him as king, for he's shown us in this bread in the wilderness. This is the anointed one. Now, we Christians have our own perspective on this, very much reflected in communion. As Jesus broke the bread and gave thanks, and the Greek word for that is Eucharista, from which we get Eucharist, it's a memory, it's a resonance of the great banquet in heaven that one day we'll all share. It's a memory, a forward memory, of the meal that Jesus would share with his disciples, and which we regularly and Christians throughout history have shared. For we know that when we take the bread and break it and lift the wine glass to our lips, we are commemorating what Jesus did on the last night on earth. Not that we think eating the bread makes us Christians, but this miracle is a foretaste of this banquet in heaven. And what it tells us is that to be a Christian is not to come to church, though thank you for doing that. It's not to be nice. It's to, like we could take a piece of bread and eat it, it's to take the Lord Jesus Christ and to invite him into our lives personally. That's what it means to be a Christian. To be so united with Christ that we've taken him into our very being and let him transform us. Think about this while I'm eating the bread. Well, people are getting hungry. And if I might paraphrase what happens, it's quite interesting. Jesus says, well, they say to Jesus, people are getting hungry, Jesus, as if, he hadn't noticed. It's a remote place. He says, well, you feed them. Not enormously encouraging. And they say, well, we've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he says, Okay, well, that's a start. Bring that to me. Let's see what we can do with what you've given. And then the miracle takes place. What does that tell us? Do you want to see miracles? Well, then you need to bring what you can to Jesus and let him miraculously, mysteriously transform it into something amazing. My friend Keith, who would never be a speaker, for many years in his home ran a little group called Agnostics Anonymous. It was for people who weren't sure they were atheists, but they certainly weren't Christians. And they wanted a place where they could ask all their questions in an unthreatening environment and just talk things through. I saw so many people find faith through Keith's little group. 5 loaves and 2 fish. A colleague of mine is called Dan. He is a brilliant musician. In fact, he's a gifted choir master. He's a music director of a big church in London. And I've worked with him just once or twice. He's a kind of Gareth Malone figure. He can get a good song out of almost anybody, and I've seen him do it. His church are offering free piano lessons to people who can't afford for their children to have them. Can you imagine what a blessing that is to people who want their children to do well but just can't afford the lessons? I wonder if in 20 years' time some of those children will be really famous musicians. 5 loaves and 2 fish. And without embarrassing anybody, because you've already heard that his funeral will take place in the next few weeks, one person in this church offers a rather grumpy, depressed, bereaved, elderly man the opportunity to join her for Christmas. And he says, rather grumpily, no, no, no. But she ignores that, and she takes him a Christmas lunch anyway. And through that, Don comes to this church and becomes a Christian and said on a number of occasions, "This is my only family." 5 loaves and 2 fish. What can you bring to Jesus? I mean, it may be your sense of humor. It may be your technical abilities, your musical skills, your good way of working with kids, your natural way with old people, a way with words. Maybe you're a great cook. Maybe you're just good in the garden or flower arranging. You know, we struggle in this church to find people to do things. We struggle to find people who will take up tasks. And I wonder if it's because people think, I'm really not good enough. I can only do this, and I don't do that very well. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Transformed by Jesus. I'm going to step down as an elder in this church in a week's time. Not in a fit of rage, don't worry. I've been an elder for 10 years, and the Constitution says, and it's quite right, that it's time for me to step down and let others take my place. It's been an honor to serve you. But I'm already thinking, what next? 5 loaves and 2 fish. What can I bring to God? What humble thing can I bring to God that he can bless and use? And for your homework, I would like you to do the same. I'd like you to think about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which was a miracle when Jesus took something so small and made it amazingly big. And ask, what could I bring? 5 loaves and 2 fish. Transformed by Jesus, it miraculously fed 5,000 people. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Transformed by Jesus, it could miraculously make his kingdom come. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Transformed by Jesus. miraculously. It could change the world.